Morning, everybody. On behalf of myself and the Migration and Food Security, or MiFOOD project, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's talk entitled Wars, Displaced Populations and Food Insecurity, which will be given by Dr. Mustafa Koch, who I will introduce in a moment. My name is Kim Rigel. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and at the Balsillie School, and co-director with Jenna Hennebree of the International Migration Research Center at Laurier and the Balsillie School. And I'm very pleased to be chairing today's session, which is part of the MiFOOD Talks series. The Migration and Food Security, or MiFOOD project, aims to design and implement a new and innovative global research and knowledge mobilization agenda focused on the interactions between migration and food security within the Global South. The project is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and it is being implemented by the Hungry Cities Partnership, a research collaboration between over 90 researchers and partner organizations in 13 countries. For more information, please check out our website at mifood.org to get more information. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to begin by giving a land acknowledgement. We give a land acknowledgement in order to recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories, and to express our gratitude for the sharing of this land that we work and live on. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. It's situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. There are long histories of migration and displacement in this region that are important to remember and understand when we are discussing contemporary migrations and displacements. In making this land acknowledgement, we also take a moment to reflect on the past and continuing legacies of colonial settler violence. And we give this land acknowledgement as a commitment to learning about and acknowledging this history as a first step in walking the path of truth and reconciliation together. And in fact, we will be having the opportunity to hear from Dr. Koch and to discuss the legacies of colonialism and displacement further in his talk, Wars, Displaced Populations and Food Security. And it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Mustafa Koch, who has been a long-time close friend and colleague, and a person whose work and work ethic I've greatly respected. Mustafa Koch is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Center for Studies in Food Security at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research and teaching interests involve food studies, food security, food policy, and the sociology of migration. Professor Koch was among the founders of the Center for Studies in Food Security, Food Secure Canada, and the Canadian Association for Food Studies. His publications on the sociology of agriculture and food, social change and development, and immigration include For Hunger-Proof Cities, Working Together from 2001, Interdisciplinary Perspectives in Food Studies from 2008, Küresel Gıda Düzeni, Kriz Derinleşirken, and Critical Perspectives in Food Studies. His current research focuses on culinary practices, food security, and food safety concerns of immigrants and refugees. And Dr. Koch recently, and most well-deserved, received the Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Association for Food Studies in 2017. Thank you very much, Mustafa, for making time to speak with us today. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Koch, who will speak for about 25 minutes. And then we'll both be back to field questions, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And those questions will come to me, and then I will share them with Dr. Koch for our session. Dr. Koch, over to you.
Since the 1996 World Food Summit, there has been a considerable progress in food security in various parts of the world, except in regions that have been experiencing armed conflicts. Global report on food crisis identified that 258 million people in 58 countries and territories faced acute food insecurity in 2022. Armed conflict was the primary reason in 19 countries such as Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Palestine, Yemen, and Haiti, affecting 117 million people. UNHCR estimates that by the end of 2024, the number of forcibly displaced and stateless people would be over 130 million. Using examples from recent cases of armed conflict from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, and Palestine, I will examine how armed conflicts contribute to food insecurity at the national, regional, and global levels. Food insecurity is generally associated with chronic poverty. In 2004, for example, only 8% of hunger-related deaths worldwide were caused by humanitarian emergencies, and 92% were associated with chronic or recurring hunger and malnutrition. However, wars, occupations, and prolonged blockades established the conditions of long-term poverty by destroying people's ability to produce their livelihoods, denying their agency to feed themselves and their families, and condemning them to long-term hunger and food insecurity. We have to remember that millions of people have been living in refugee camps such as Palestinians, Afghans, Rohingya, Syrians, and more in abject poverty for sometimes decades. Food security is defined as a condition in which all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. There could be several reasons why and how armed conflicts may lead to food insecurity. Wars destroy essential infrastructure, affecting people's ability to access, process, distribute, and utilize food. Conflict weakens the local economy, reduces employment opportunities, and increases poverty levels, especially among internally displaced and asylum seekers. Landmines and bombs destroy agricultural land, mills, markets, storage facilities, and clean water sources. Access to food and water can be denied through blockades and embargoes. Health systems are usually damaged or destroyed, leaving people reliant on humanitarian support. Insecurity and roadblocks prevent humanitarian convoys from reaching the most vulnerable. Wars cause deterioration of public security and social safety. Governments cut social programs, diverting funds towards the war effort. Displaced populations can trigger new crises in surrounding regions where they are seeking refuge. We also remember that most aid is in the form of military aid. These are often used to support friendly regimes involved in wars against their people or their neighbors. Military aid also denies the chance of these funds being used for causes such as ending hunger. A glance at the amount of US aid since 1946 demonstrates that strategic priorities tend to be more important than the needs of the vulnerable. In 2023, for example, US military aid to Israel exceeded $3.8 billion. On February 13th this year, the US Senate approved another $14.3 billion aid package for Israel. I'd like to talk briefly about some cases where wars were directly involved in food insecurity and hunger. I was in Iraq in January 2003 with a group of researchers to write a report on the potential impacts of the war on Iraqi children, where 500,000 of them had already died during the sanctions regime between 1991 and 2003, according to the UNICEF reports. We presented our report, Our Common Responsibility, the impact of a new war on Iraqi children just before the start of the war. We later published a paper to look at the early effects of the war on food security in 2007. All I can say is that our estimates were very modest in 2003. Following NATO intervention and regime change in Libya in 2011, civil war between rival groups and militias made life miserable for most Libyans, and many sought refuge in neighboring countries. Migrant workers from Northern and Central Africa who supported their families with remittances were worse off and had limited options going back home to live in poverty, joining militias or other armed groups as soldiers of fortune, or going to Europe as asylum seekers. Human Rights Watch reported in September 2022 that around 25,000 people have drowned since 2014 in the Mediterranean Sea in attempts to reach the European Union. These were people trying to escape from hunger and poverty that the strategists of the Libyan war never thought about. In the chaos of intergroup rivalry in Libya, the European Union has been funding abusive militias to stop the illegal migration to Europe. This funding continues for many countries in the Middle East and in different parts of the world. And European Union, for example, funds Turkey to a tune of over $10 billion so far. We have also been studying patterns of food insecurity among refugees from Afghanistan and Syria, two of the countries that have suffered armed conflict and foreign interventions. Millions of Afghans and Syrians have been internally displaced or living as refugees in neighboring countries under horrible conditions. Food insecurity rates are very high among Syrian and Afghan refugees, even among those who managed to reach places such as Canada. The Russia-Ukraine war was another case with global impacts on food insecurity around the world. Around 48 countries relied heavily on imports from Russia and Ukraine for fuel, fertilizers, and essential food commodities like wheat, maize, and sunflower oil. The blockades of the Black Sea ports led to shortages in these countries, and they had to pay higher prices to get their supplies through the global markets. This was a major factor in food price inflations, hurting the poorest. At least the poor Ukrainians were luckier than the Afghan and Syrian refugees, as European borders were open for them. The double standard of Western humanitarianism was apparent, unfortunately, for the refugees from the global South, when South Asian students or African medical personnel tried to enter European Union borders to escape from the war. They were denied that chance. The latest war in Gaza we have been watching helplessly since October 2023 is another example of a double standard. Despite warnings from various experts about the potential impacts of this urban warfare in one of the most densely populated refugee camps in the world, the UN system failed to stop atrocities such as the use of phosphorus bombs and the bombing of hospitals, schools, power plants, and water facilities. Several nations armed and financed the war while stopping their contributions to UNRWA, the only UN agency that supports the relief and human development of Palestinian refugees. As of today, the death toll is estimated as 32,414. As many bodies are buried under the rubble, this number can be higher, according to the Washington Post. Using publicly available data, Oxfam calculated that by January 15th, with a death toll of 250 a day, the number of average deaths per day for Gaza was higher than any recent major armed conflict, including Syria, 96.5 deaths per day, Sudan, 51.6, Iraq 50.8, Ukraine 43.9, Afghanistan 23.8, and Yemen for 15.8. This crisis is worsened by Israel's restrictions on the entry of aid, closing borders, and imposing a total siege. On March 6, 2024, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, stated that in Gaza today, we are witnessing how Israel is using starvation as one of its tools to commit genocide. We have never seen a civilian population made to go hungry so quickly and completely compared to any other place in the world in modern history. Now, children are starting to die from malnutrition and dehydration, which indicates that famine is already striking Gaza, or famine is around the corner. We have never seen children pushed into malnutrition so quickly anywhere else in the world. He added, the reason Israel could make 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza go hungry so quickly and completely because Israel was already strangling Gaza through a 17-year blockade, keeping everyone on the precipice of hunger. Before the war, 50% of the people in Gaza were food insecure and 80% relied on humanitarian aid. On March 18th, World Food Programme Executive Director Cindy McCain said, people in Gaza are starving to death right now. The speed at which this man-made hunger and malnutrition crisis has ripped through Gaza is terrifying. For famine to be declared, at least 20% of the population must be suffering extreme food shortages, with 1 in 3 children acutely malnourished and 2 people or 4 children out of every 10,000 dying daily from starvation or malnutrition and disease. A famine is assessed by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC. It's an initiative comprising more than a dozen UN agencies, regional bodies, and aid groups. In late December, the IPC said the situation in Gaza had already exceeded the 20% threshold. There's a risk of famine in the projection period through May 2024 if the current situation persists or worsens. The war is not causing food insecurity and famine, but destroying agricultural land, water resources, medical facilities, bakeries, and power plants. People are not even allowed to fish from the sea. The impact of this brutal attack on food sovereignty and the right to food could not be easily remedied for decades. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell said that Israel is provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Article 7.2.b, identifies the intentional infliction of conditions of life, inter alia, the deprivation of access to food and medicine, calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population as extermination in its description of crimes against humanity. Likewise, Article 8.2b identifies intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies as provided for under the Geneva Conventions as a war crime. This is also a hugely costly war for Israel. While we do not know the total death toll for the IDF members and police officers, we have some estimates, around 643 so far, and except those who were killed during the Hamas raid, we don't know the civilian deaths, but in October, Hamas The war is costing the Israeli economy around $600 million a week due to work absences, according to the Bank of Israel. The number of tourists in January declined by 80%. The daily cost of the Gaza war was estimated at $269 million a day, and these dollars are American dollars, US dollars. Rand Corporation estimated that Israel could lose some $400 billion in economic activity over the next decade. The war's economic impacts go beyond the region. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, for example, affected 30% of the global sea traffic. A 43% decrease in traffic through the Suez Canal and a 60% increase in traffic around the Cape of Good Hope, a longer and considerably more expensive route. We cannot even estimate the cost of this on inflation rates around the world. In his book, The End of History and the Last Man, Francis Fukuyama argued that the end of history meant the triumph of liberal democracy as the ultimate form of government and a better system economically, politically, and ethically. Fukuyama's optimistic post-Cold War thesis is being put to the test these days. In the last 30 years, since Fukuyama published The End of the History, we have seen growing inequalities between rich and poor worldwide. While globalization has given freedom of movement only to corporations and the wealthy, it has left billions of poor and low-income people unable to move beyond the borders of nation-states or refugee camps. People in the slums of Haiti live at the mercy of gangs as we are speaking today. In its 2023 report, Oxfam International announced that the richest 1% earned almost one-third of all new wealth created since 2020, a total of $42 trillion, close to double the earnings of the remaining 99% of the world's population. Television programs and social media show the extravagance and greed of the rich and famous. In India, where 16.4% of the population lives below the poverty line, Indian billionaire Mukesh Ambani spent over $152 million for the pre-wedding festivities of his son Anand. While this amount barely makes a dent in Ambani's net worth of $117.7 billion, one can only imagine what could be done for the hungry people in the slums of Mumbai for a portion of that money. As social inequalities increase, food security continues to remain a global concern. In the 1996 World Food Summit set a target of halving the number of food insecure people from an estimated 800 million to 400 million by 2015. Estimates for 2022 showed that some 783 million people still continue to face hunger. 333 million of them are facing acute food insecurity. These figures do not include war-torn countries and undocumented migrants due to a lack of data. Even in major food exporting countries, the number of people who are food insecure is increasing rather than decreasing. In Canada, for example, the number of families receiving food assistance from food banks in March 2023 reached nearly 2 million in 1 month, a record number since the first food bank opened in 1981. The regional wars that have displaced millions of people in the last 30 years, the refugee problem, the recent horror of genocide that the whole world is watching helplessly, the collapse of the UN system, and the doublespeak and discriminatory humanity of global leadership all reflect a global legitimacy crisis. Meanwhile, global military spending in 2023 reached a record high $2.2 trillion. In the last 3 decades, the invasion of sovereign nations by superpowers and the repeated and flagrant violations of international law, the Geneva Conventions, and fundamental human rights and freedoms by many countries have brought our civilization closer and closer to a catastrophe. This is a world of politicians who lie without blinking an eye, arms traders, power worshippers, double standards, silenced universities, embedded press, and crippled civil society organizations. Perhaps the world ahead of us is the world of the marginals, the homo sacer, as Giorgio Agamben calls them, those who have lost all human rights and could be killed with impunity. Perhaps Fukuyama will have to rewrite the end of history as the end of liberal democracy. But at this rate, I worry that the end of history may be the end of the Anthropocene. It is difficult to talk about ethics and peace in a world whose moral compass has gone astray and is trying to discipline its citizens with fear and violence. But we mustn't give up. Anyone who believes that a just and democratic world and living together in peace is possible and desirable must resist this apocalyptic vision. Nothing is more dangerous than our learned helplessness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Thank you very much, Dr. Koch. This was a fabulous presentation and obviously so important in the moment. And I really appreciated you speaking to the situation of Palestinians and what is happening in Gaza. I'm going to open up the questions for panelists. Please send me your questions in the Q&A. We have about half an hour for questions, if there are any. And maybe I can just begin as people are waiting to submit questions. I was wondering, Mustafa, if you could just speak a little bit about, I mean, just following up on what you were talking about in terms of Gaza and the situation and the World Bank calling this an impending catastrophic famine that's going to affect at least half the population, 1.1 million out of 2.3 Palestinians in the immediate. I was just curious to hear your thoughts about the short-term, the relationship between the short-term and the long-term connection of food insecurity, because obviously this is the food insecurity in the immediate. But I think some reports have suggested even if we were to restore aid, to get immediate aid in, because of, as you mentioned, the destruction of infrastructure, agricultural lands, water supply, this is really a situation of food insecurity in the future as well. I was just wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about the connection between the immediate and the long term.
Yes, unfortunately, because of the damage done, this is not a new issue. It has been going on for 17 years in the Gaza region. But what is happening right now is almost total destruction, especially in northern Gaza. And all facilities are destroyed, and the ability of the people to recover will take decades and constant support from the international community. Without that support, they will not be able to survive there.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, many countries in North America and Europe, including Canada, at least for a brief period, cut their support for UNRWA. This is the UN agency that has been helping Palestinian people to survive since 1940s. And this situation is very, very difficult, and we can expect this humanitarian tragedy to continue for a long, long time. And of course, this puts a big burden on Israel too, is the occupying force. And according to the international rules of conduct, they are responsible, they are accountable, they have to pay for the damages and restoration. And I doubt if that will happen.
Thank
So
you.
it is a really difficult situation we are dealing with.
Yes, extremely difficult. There's a question from Monica Korzen, which asks about, do you believe in the faith of global institutions and formal processes, or will the changes take place via informal pressure like social media or reputation?
Yeah, at the moment, the international agencies, global institutions failed, very badly failed. And but we cannot afford this failure. We cannot continue to accept this failure. We are not only betraying Palestinian people, but we are also betraying Israelis too. But we are also betraying many other future victims of violence and wars. Because if we cannot stop similar situations around the world, this will continue. Russia will invade Ukraine, China will invade Taiwan. I mean, if there is no impunity, if there is no rule of law, we can go all the way. The reason why we found ourselves in the Second World War, it was because of the failure of the League of Nations. And we cannot afford a similar failure. We really are responsible for this. We have to protect not only just the people of Gaza, but we have to protect the rest of the world from similar violations. And this is not the first one. This is probably the brutalist one, as the evidence shows us. But this is not the first one of unilateral occupation and invasion and breaking of international law. And many of these superpowers were involved. And if they will continue, we will not have peace around the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's hard to be talking about global institutions at this moment and what we can do in such a place, but we do need, as you said, to not give into that and to think about what can be done. There are a couple questions further to that, so let me ask some of these. From Fatmanur Deliolu, what can we as citizens do to ensure that all people have access to health and sufficient food rather than governments investing in the military? How can we create pressure on governments, and what are our duties as individuals?
Yeah, if I can give credit to neoliberal ideology, their success was due to making us to accept the market rules as the reality and stop dreaming, stop our utopias. We no longer think beyond what is happening right now. The whole world became realistic. The whole world stopped dreaming about peace. I remember the day when I was protesting the South African ambassador in front of University of Toronto back in the 1980s. And I also remember the day when Nelson Mandela received an honorary doctorate in my university in early 2000s. In 1980s, I could not believe that anything can be possible at that time, that we could put an end to apartheid. But it became possible. So I want to believe that peace is possible. I want to believe that a change is possible. And for this, We need the cooperation of the whole world. We need the cooperation of both sides in Palestine and Israel. I mean, if naively maybe, if I could imagine these two very creative and innovative and hardworking people with their determination to make peace, they would be formidable. Maybe, I don't know, I'm just like speculating. Maybe some other Middle Eastern powers and the rest of the world do not want them to achieve that success. I'm joking, saying it jokingly. But we really have to work wherever we are for peace, because the consequences of not having peace is tremendous. We cannot afford continuation of wars, especially nuclear wars, especially biological warfare in the 21st century.
Thank you. And I mean, one of the things that came up very strongly in your talk also was the interconnectedness of food security and food insecurity between people in different parts of the world. And I think there's a question from Dr. Jonathan Crush here, who is asking to this question. He says, thank you very much, Mustafa. Could you say something about the impact of war in one place on distant populations who are not directly involved in the conflict? For example, Africans affected by Russia's grain blockade.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like the best example in that situation was the trade when the trade from Russia and Ukraine was blockaded for a period. It created tremendous food price inflation in certain parts of the world. We are living in a global and highly interdependent world. Even the long trade routes right now as a result of the war in Israel and Gaza is costing to the rest of us. But we are also paying for these wars ourselves. Billions of dollars. We are paying for the armaments. $2.2 trillion. Imagine what percentage of that money could solve food insecurity and agricultural development all around the world. The reason why, again, I'm saying this naively, the reason why Japan and Germany could recover dramatically from the Second World War's destruction, because they were denied military buildup, at least for some period, and they could rebuild their industry. And if we could use our resources in productive ventures instead of killing each other, I think we could solve many, many problems. But in a global world, in an interdependent world, what happens in one place has consequences in another place, even though it may not be apparent to some of us who are observing what's happening right now on the grounds. Many people are telling me what's happening, why we have food price inflation all around the world. And nobody wants to think about the cost of these wars on the global markets.
It's true, that's not often factored in when we hear just even in the regular discussion of inflation and higher prices of food in Canada. There is another question, which is again going back to Gaza and asking about the possibility of change and asking about whether elections in the US would impact or change the conditions in Gaza, whether there's any possibility of that.
I think
asking you to predict maybe a little bit, but do
yeah,
you see any kind of change coming from the US?
I want to think separate the political processes and politicians from the state's rules and state institutions. And in many parts of the world, the state machine has been left intact. And despite one politician it comes, another politician goes. The politicians make not too much impact on the actions of that nation, but the institutions, as long as they work and they are functional, they can recover. They can do things differently despite their leadership. And we see the disasters happening in countries where the state machine is broken, deliberately broken, and then the politicians turn into dictators and rule as they wish. And I think, I want to believe that the damage the leadership can do in the US is limited. Naively, I hope. And because many people are seeing what is happening. Many people are seeing that the current situation is unsustainable. And regardless of who comes and who goes, as long as these people are aware of what is going on and willing to put an end, change can be possible. It is not easy, but we really have to. The whole world should be demanding such change.
In terms of demanding change, there's another question, Mustafa, in the questions, which gets at some of this as well, from Doug Jones. And I'll just read the full scope. It's many believe there is enough food and the distribution and the political issues are the problem. It seems as if food has been used as a weapon in more subtle ways than is obvious in Gaza in our recent history. Politics is about power and control, and food is central. When I look at the patterns, I see a similar challenge at the local level as well. Food as a right is a difficult argument to make for so many reasons. Yet in many more ways, it is the easiest stance to take. There are parallels between the local situations and the international. What are the most effective ways to take action for those of us who have minimal positions of power to make a difference? So again, going into this perspective of, what can we do, in our everyday lives as citizens that care about what's happening?
It is like Bruce Cernine had a very interesting and positive critique of the right to food argument, and in his book Tyranny of Rights, and it is really difficult to defend the right to food, especially in this current situation, because we still do not have an international system of governance, and nation states are still the rulers. And in this current chaos, it is really difficult to handle rights. Nevertheless, the argument of rights are still very important because their violation justifies action. What kind of action? What can we do in our communities is important. But what can we do to change the politics within our national boundaries and change politics at the international arena is also important. I think as citizens, we should be doing more than voting for one party or another. Real democracy is not just having an electoral system, but making sure that the institutions are functioning according to the book as needed and as effectively. And making those people who are violating, people who are breaking those institutions should be accountable and should be paying the price.
Thank you.
That's what we can do, at least as citizens.
Yes, that's absolutely. I feel like if this one was taking you to ask you about us and at the local level, The next question is asking you maybe not so much about the food insecurity, but to a question that's broader, so you may or may not wish to answer, was asking you really to think about the geopolitical long-term impacts of the conflict. So Charles Levko says, you have pointed to a series of realities and facts regarding the use of food as a weapon of war. Yet as Israel continues to perpetuate a genocide, ethnic cleansing, civil society, including academics and social movements and decision makers, seem worlds apart on how to respond, or even if they should respond. How do you think the current manifestation of this conflict is changing domestic politics and global geopolitical alignments? So that's a very big question. And what do you think are longer term impacts of the current conflict? So again, maybe thinking about the longer term, even with the food insecurity question, even if we were to, be immediately able to address what's happening, what would be the longer term impacts of the conflict for food insecurity, maybe longer term, and maybe more globally than regionally.
Yeah, we are going through a global crisis. I want to see this some kind of a period of change, kind of an interregnum between one hegemonic period and another hegemonic period. So we are going through this crisis period right now, and we really have to think about what should be the next hegemonic order is likely to bring us. If we will let authoritarian rule to prevail, and if we accept the failure of liberal democracy, despite its limitations, we are going to be maybe as successful as China and Russia, but we will be living in a very different society here in Canada, elsewhere in the West. We have to ask ourselves what kind of world we like to see ourselves in, and what can we do as citizens to protect and create and imagine a better world. And that's why I'm basically saying that we really have to go back to our utopias, think about, dream about a better world, instead of accepting the brutal reality of the market rationalists or the geostrategists. And we do not have another choice. We do not have another choice, because the alternative could be living in a very, very authoritarian, very discriminatory system that we don't want to live in. And I don't know what can be done, but I think we collectively need to think and find solutions.
Thinking about solutions and changes possible, can I ask you also, Mustafa, from your long time in Canada being an advocate, an activist for food security, from your work at the Centre for Studies in Food Security, and also with the Canadian Association for Food Studies and Food Secure Canada, can I ask you just to reflect a little bit about on what you see as the change that's been accomplished in Canada around food security? Are there certain points that objectives or goals that you would point to that you think we've done well, and maybe some areas, of course, where we know that food insecurity has grown in Canada, right? And among certain populations where that needs to be addressed. How do you reflect on that in terms of Canada and where we are with food insecurity?
There is progress, but we should never take progress for granted. And the moment when we think that we have achieved or we have reached our target, that's the beginning of failure. Demanding democracy, defending food democracy, defending food security, food justice is not a dream that can be achieved. Even if we achieve that, we have to keep continuing and working. And And when I look back since 1978 for this report, which was published by civil society, The Land of Milk and Money, we have done considerably well. We have achieved certain things, but it is not easy. Even mobilizing some of our organizations to sign a petition about the dangers of this war, we had to struggle. And at the end, our working together in harmony made it possible. So I believe that we really have to keep working together, keep listening to each other, and keep demanding change. Otherwise, we will decline further. So it is just like we have in Turkish, we have the term Janissary March. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But sometimes we go 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And that's the danger.
Thank you. I don't think there are any more questions. I'll just wait one moment, but if not, maybe that's a good place to end things. And hopefully we're going 2 steps forward and 1 step back will work for that, as opposed to the other way
I want
around.
to be optimistic. Because there's no place for pessimism, because the pessimism is very dangerous. We cannot afford that realistic pessimism. We have to be optimistic, and we have to trust each other that we can make a difference.
I'd like to really, on behalf of everyone, thank you, Dr. Mustafa Koç, so much for being with us and for sharing all of your thoughts on this really important topic, and particularly on speaking on what has been happening in Gaza as well, which is so important in impending crisis. So thank you so much on behalf of MiFOOD and on behalf of myself and the IMRC as well. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody at the next talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.